He was called the Great, a man whose name would echo through history for more than 2,000 years. A young king who dreamed not only of ruling Greece, but of conquering the entire known world. His name was Alexander, but before he became a legend, he was just a boy full of dreams, fire, and destiny. Welcome to Talking English, the channel where you learn English through powerful stories that change the world. If you love history, if you love learning while feeling inspired, make sure to subscribe, leave your like, and stay until the end. Because today, you will discover the story of a man who was unstoppable, a man who believed he was born to rule the earth. This is the story of Alexander the Great. The year was 356 BC. In the small kingdom of Macedonia, far north of Greece, a baby cried for the first time inside the royal palace of Pella. That baby was Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. On the night of his birth, something strange happened. The great temple of Artemis in Ephesus burned down. Many believed it was a sign from the gods that a new conqueror had been born. From his first breath, Alexander's mother told him he was special. She said he was not only the son of Philip, but also the son of Zeus, the king of the gods. She raised him to believe he had a divine mission, that he was chosen to do something no other man had ever done. His father, Philip, was a warrior and a visionary. He built one of the strongest armies in the world and dreamed of uniting all of Greece. From him, Alexander learned courage, leadership, and strength. But from his mother, he learned passion, faith, and destiny. Even as a child, he showed signs of greatness. He was curious, intelligent, and full of energy. One day, a wild horse was brought to the palace. No one could control it. The horse was angry, kicking and screaming. Everyone was afraid, but young Alexander noticed something. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. So, he turned the horse toward the sun, and suddenly, the animal calmed down. He climbed onto its back and rode across the field, shocking everyone. His father smiled and said, "My son, you must find another kingdom. Macedonia is too small for you." Those words stayed with Alexander forever. From that day on, he knew his destiny to conquer the world. When Alexander was 13 years old, his father, King Philip II, decided it was time for him to have the best education possible. He wanted his son not only to be a warrior, but also a thinker, a man of wisdom and knowledge. So Philip sent a message to the most brilliant philosopher in all of Greece, Aristotle. Aristotle was already famous across the ancient world. He had studied at Plato's Academy in Athens and had spent his life searching for truth and logic. When Aristotle arrived in Macedonia, he found a curious and restless boy, one who wanted to learn everything about the universe. Under his guidance, Alexander studied science, literature, politics, and philosophy. He learned about the stars in the sky, the human body, the laws of reason, and the importance of ethics. But Aristotle did more than teach him facts. He taught him how to think, how to question, how to analyze, and how to lead with both the mind and the heart. He told Alexander, "The aim of education is not only to know what is good, but to become good." Alexander listened carefully. He began to understand that power without wisdom is dangerous, and that knowledge without character is empty. In those years, Aristotle also introduced him to the works of Homer, the poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Alexander fell in love with those stories, especially the hero Achilles, who fought with courage and passion. He even slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow every night. To him, Achilles was more than a hero. He was a model of greatness, a man who lived and died for eternal glory. And deep inside, Alexander wanted the same. Those lessons, that knowledge, and that fire would soon turn him into something the world had never seen before. A warrior philosopher, guided by wisdom and driven by destiny. Alexander grew stronger every year. His mind was full of Aristotle's wisdom, and his heart was full of fire. While other boys played games, Alexander trained with soldiers. He learned how to fight, how to ride horses, and how to command men much older than him. When he was just 16, his father, King Philip II, went away to fight in another part of the kingdom. He left young Alexander in charge, as regent of Macedonia. Many nobles doubted him. They whispered, "He is just a boy. What can he do?" But soon, they discovered who Alexander really was. When a nearby tribe called the Mede rebelled against Macedonia, Alexander did not wait for his father's return. He gathered his soldiers and marched against them. The rebels laughed when they saw the young prince leading the army. But before the sun set, they were defeated. Alexander destroyed their fortress and built a new city in its place, naming it Alexandropolis, after himself. It was the first city to carry his name, but not the last. 2 years later, at only 18, Alexander fought beside his father at the Battle of Chaeronea against the powerful Greek city-states. The battle was fierce. Warriors clashed with swords, spears, and shields. In the middle of the chaos, young Alexander led the cavalry and broke through the enemy line. His courage turned the tide of the entire battle. When victory came, his father looked at him with pride and said, "My son, find yourself another kingdom. Macedonia is too small for you." Those words became a prophecy, one that would shape Alexander's destiny forever. From that day, he was no longer just a prince. He was a leader, chosen by fate, ready to change the world. The year was 336 BC. Macedonia stood strong and united under King Philip II. But peace never lasts long in a world full of ambition. One summer evening, during a great celebration in the city of Igi, the king walked proudly through the crowd. Soldiers, nobles, and allies from across Greece were there to honor him. Then, suddenly tragedy struck. A shadow moved behind the king, and a dagger flashed. In seconds, King Philip II fell to the ground, bleeding. The assassin was caught and killed, but the damage was done. The great warrior king was dead, and his 20-year-old son, Alexander, became king. The throne was his, but so were the dangers. Many nations and tribes thought Macedonia would fall apart without Philip. They believed the young king would be weak and easy to overthrow. But Alexander was not a boy anymore. He had been trained for this moment his entire life. With calm determination, he took control of the kingdom. He executed those who plotted against him, secured loyalty from his generals, and united his army once again. In just a few months, he crushed rebellions in the north and marched south into Greece, where city-states like Thebes dared to defy him. Thebes believed Alexander would show mercy. They were wrong. He surrounded the city, broke its defenses, and destroyed it completely. Only temples and the home of the poet Pindar were spared. It was a clear message to all of Greece. The young king was not to be challenged. Fear spread across the land, and one by one, all the Greek states submitted to him. In less than a year, Alexander had done what few rulers could. He had turned chaos into order, fear into loyalty, and himself into a legend in the making. The dust of Thebes had barely settled when Alexander began to look east. His father, King Philip II, had always dreamed of conquering the Persian Empire, the largest and richest empire the world had ever known. Now, that dream belonged to Alexander. But this was no ordinary ambition. Persia stretched from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to India. Millions of people, hundreds of cities, and an army that dwarfed his own. Yet, Alexander did not hesitate. He believed destiny was calling him. Before leaving, he visited the Temple of Delphi, where the oracle spoke for the god Apollo. When he arrived, the priestess refused to see him, saying it was not the right day for prophecy. But Alexander would not accept that. He took her hand and pulled her toward the temple. Surprised, she cried out, "My son, you are invincible." Alexander smiled. That was all the prophecy he needed. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow sea between Europe and Asia, with an army of about 40,000 men. When he stepped onto the Asian shore, he threw a spear into the ground and said, "From now on, Asia is mine by the sword." His men cheered. The greatest adventure in history had begun. Soon after, the Persian army met him near the Granicus River. The Persians had more soldiers, more horses, and stronger positions, but Alexander had something they didn't: courage, strategy, and faith in his destiny. He charged across the river, leading from the front. Arrows flew, Swords clashed, and the water turned red with battle. By nightfall, the Persians were defeated. It was Alexander's first great victory, a victory that announced to the world that a new power had risen. As he looked across the battlefield, the young king whispered, "This is only the beginning." After the Battle of the Granicus River, Alexander's fame spread like fire through Asia Minor, the land we now call Turkey. Many cities had been under Persian rule for more than 200 years. They paid heavy taxes and lived under fear of the great king in Persia. When Alexander and his army marched through the land, people expected another conqueror, another man who would take everything for himself. But what they found was something different. Alexander did not destroy cities that surrendered. Instead, he respected their traditions, restored their freedom, and often left local leaders in charge. He called himself not a conqueror, but a liberator. When he entered the city of Ephesus, people filled the streets, throwing flowers and shouting his name. They saw him as the one who had freed them from Persian control. He ordered that the statue of the goddess Artemis be repaired, the same temple that had burned down on the night he was born. For Alexander, this was more than a coincidence. It was destiny. As he continued through the region, he visited ancient shrines, honored local gods, and spoke to priests and scholars. He wanted to understand the cultures he met, not just rule them. To his soldiers, this sometimes seemed strange, but Alexander believed that to rule the world, one must also respect the world. In every city he entered, he left behind a new order, less oppression, more freedom. And soon, word spread across the Persian Empire. A new kind of king is coming, one who fights like Achilles, but rules like a friend. As his army grew stronger and his fame grew brighter, Alexander began to realize something profound. He was no longer just fulfilling his father's dream. He was creating his own. It was 333 BC. Alexander and his army had been marching for months across mountains and deserts. The men were tired, but their spirits were high. Then came news that would change everything. King Darius III, the great king of Persia himself, was coming, leading an army said to number over 100,000 men. The Persians were confident. They believed one young Macedonian could never defeat the power of Asia. But Alexander saw things differently. To him, Darius was not a god or a legend. He was simply another man standing between him and destiny. The two armies met near a narrow valley by the Panaris River, close to the town of Issus. The rain fell. The wind howled. Alexander stood at the front of his men, wearing a shining helmet. His horse, Bucephalus, restless beneath him. He looked at his soldiers and shouted, "Remember, we fight for glory, for Greece, and for the ages to come." The Macedonians roared. The Persians answered with a thunder of drums. Then the battle began. Darius's army was vast, but the narrow field gave Alexander the advantage. His troops moved like a single body, disciplined, fearless, unstoppable. At the center of the storm, Alexander led his companion cavalry, charging directly toward Darius's position. Spears clashed, chariots shattered, and the air was filled with the sound of steel and screams. At one point, Alexander's spear broke. He grabbed another from a fallen soldier and pressed forward, his eyes locked on the Persian king. Seeing the young conqueror charging at him, Darius lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled. The Persian army broke. Soldiers dropped their weapons and ran in every direction. The Battle of Issus was over. The great king had escaped, but his family, his wife, his mother, and his daughters were captured. That night, Alexander visited their tent. The women feared for their lives, but he treated them with respect. He told Darius's mother, "You shall be honored as a queen, for your son has lost the crown, not his dignity." Word of his mercy spread through the empire. Alexander had proven that he was not only a warrior, he was a leader of honor, and perhaps something even greater. After defeating Darius at the Battle of Issus, Alexander moved south along the Mediterranean coast. City after city fell before him. Some surrendered peacefully, others resisted and paid the price. But Alexander's greatest test was still ahead: Egypt. Egypt had long been part of the Persian Empire, ruled by foreign kings. Its people were tired of oppression. They prayed for freedom, and when Alexander arrived, they believed their prayers were answered. There was no battle, no bloodshed. The Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator, not an invader. In the ancient city of Memphis, the priests of Ammonius placed a golden crown upon his head and called him Son of the Sun. To them, Alexander was not just a great leader, he was almost divine. Yet Alexander did not let pride blind him. He respected the Egyptian gods and people. He joined their ceremonies, studied their traditions, and promised to rule with justice. But he also had a vision, a dream that would outlast his lifetime. Standing on the coast between the Nile Delta and the Mediterranean Sea, he looked at the horizon and said, "Here, I will build a city, one that will never die." That city would be called Alexandria. It would become a center of knowledge, trade, and culture, a bridge between East and West, between Greece and Egypt, between the past and the future. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander traveled deep into the desert to the Oracle of Siwa, a mysterious temple said to speak for the god Zeus Ammon. There, the priests greeted him with sacred words. "You are the son of Zeus." No one knows exactly what happened inside the temple that day, but when Alexander came out, his eyes shone with quiet confidence. He believed he was no longer just a king. He was chosen by the gods, and with that belief, he turned his gaze east, toward the heart of Persia, where Darius was waiting. It was the year 331 BC. For 2 years, King Darius III had been gathering a new army, larger and stronger than before. This time, he would not run. He would destroy the young Macedonian king once and for all. Alexander, now just 25 years old, led his men through deserts and mountains, following the Persian army to the plains of Gaugamela, near modern-day Iraq. The night before the battle, his generals urged him to attack immediately, while the enemy was not ready. But Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory in the dark," he said. "I will win it under the light of the sun." Dawn came. As the sun rose, both armies faced each other across a vast plain. The Persians numbered more than 200,000, chariots, cavalry, elephants, and soldiers from every corner of the empire. Alexander had 40,000, but he had something far greater a plan. He ordered his men into a diagonal formation, the famous oblique strategy. As the Persians moved forward, Alexander's line shifted slightly to the right, pulling Darius's forces off balance. Then, in one flash of courage, Alexander charged straight through the gap, leading his companion cavalry toward the Persian king himself. The ground shook, spears clashed, the sky was filled with dust and arrows. Once again, Alexander led from the front. Darius saw him coming, and fear took over. He turned his chariot and fled the field. The great king of Persia had run away once more. The Persian army collapsed. Thousands surrendered. Others were cut down as they tried to escape. Alexander rode through the chaos, his armor shining like fire under the morning sun. The battle was won. Persia, the greatest empire of its time, had fallen. As he stood on the battlefield, Alexander looked east and whispered, "There are no more kings, only me." That day, he became not just the ruler of Greece, but the king of kings, the new master of the world. The dust of Gaugamela had barely settled when Alexander marched toward the heart of Persia. City after city opened its gates. No army dared to stop him anymore. When he entered Babylon, people lined the streets, throwing flowers and singing songs of welcome. The temples burned incense, and priests called him the chosen of the gods. The city was full of wonders, gardens that hung in the air, walls of colored brick, and palaces filled with gold. For the first time, Alexander saw what true wealth looked like. From there, he moved to Susa, and then to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, the city of the great kings. Its treasures were unimaginable: gold, silver, and jewels stacked high in towers, treasures collected from every land Persia had conquered. Alexander stood in the palace of Darius, surrounded by the symbols of the empire he had defeated. And for the first time, something changed in him. The young man who once called himself a liberator now began to see himself as more, as a ruler not only of men, but of the world itself. One night, During a great feast, flames filled the air. Persepolis was burning. Some say Alexander ordered the fire himself to avenge the Persian invasion of Greece a century earlier. Others say it was an accident caused by the drunken crowd. But as the city burned, Alexander watched in silence, the reflection of the flames dancing in his eyes. The empire of Persia was gone. In its place stood something new, an empire ruled by Alexander, the man now known as the King of Kings. Yet deep inside, he felt restless. He had conquered the known world, but his heart whispered, "There's still more beyond." With Persia conquered, Alexander could have stopped. He could have ruled the greatest empire on earth and lived as a god among men. But that was not enough. The fire inside him burned too brightly. He wanted to go further, to see what lay beyond the edge of the world. His army followed him east, across deserts where the sand burned their feet and through mountains covered in snow. They crossed the mighty Hindu Kush, where icy winds froze soldiers in their sleep. Yet Alexander pressed on, his spirit unbroken. Along the way, he faced constant rebellion. Cities rose against him. Tribes tried to ambush him, but each time, he crushed them with precision and speed. His army admired him, but they also feared him. They said he never rested, never stopped, never doubted. In Bactria, he met a woman named Roxana, a local princess known for her beauty and courage. Unlike many others, she was not afraid of him. She spoke to him as an equal, and something changed in Alexander's heart. He fell in love. Their marriage was more than romance. It was a symbol, the union of East and West, of conqueror and conquered. But even love could not slow him down. Soon after, he turned his gaze further east, toward the mysterious land of India, where mighty kings and war elephants waited. His generals begged him to stop. "We have conquered enough," they said. "Let us go home." But Alexander only smiled. "Home," he said. "The world itself is my home." And with that, he marched on, toward the land of rivers, jungles, and destiny. The year was 326 BC. Alexander and his men had marched farther than any Greek army in history. Ahead of them flowed the mighty Hydaspes River in what is now modern Pakistan. On the other side waited King Porus, ruler of a powerful Indian kingdom, with an army unlike anything the Macedonians had ever seen. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of war elephants, giants of flesh and steel. The ground shook as they moved. Alexander looked across the river and smiled. He admired brave enemies, and Porus was clearly one of them. But he also knew that hesitation meant defeat. So one night, under heavy rain, he led his army secretly across the river at a distant point. When the sun rose, Porus saw the impossible. Alexander's army already on his side of the river, ready for battle. The two kings faced each other. Elephants roared. Horses screamed. Arrows flew like black rain. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Alexander's men struggled at first. The elephants crushed soldiers and broke the lines. But the Macedonians adapted quickly. They attacked the elephants' sides and blinded them, while the cavalry flanked Porus's army. For hours, the fight raged in the mud and rain. Finally, Alexander charged straight toward Porus himself. The Indian king stood tall on his elephant, refusing to retreat. Even when wounded, he fought on, proud and fearless. When the battle ended, thousands lay on the ground, but both kings were still standing. Alexander approached the defeated Porus and asked, "How would you like me to treat you?" Porus, still bleeding, looked at him and said, "Like a king." Alexander smiled. "Then you shall have your wish." He not only spared Porus, but made him an ally, giving him more lands and honor than before. To his soldiers, it was shocking. To Alexander, it was simple. "Greatness," he said, "is not in destroying your enemies, but in winning their respect." That day, the legend of Alexander grew even stronger, but deep inside, his men began to whisper, "How much further can we go before we lose ourselves?" The victory over King Porus made Alexander the master of India, but it also pushed his army to the breaking point. For nearly 8 years, they had marched across continents, through deserts, mountains, and endless battles. They had left their homes far behind, and many had died along the way. Now, as they reached the borders of the mysterious East, near the Hyphasis River, Alexander announced his next dream. "We will cross this river," he said, "and conquer the lands beyond. I will see the ocean at the end of the world." But this time no one cheered. The camp was silent. His generals bowed their heads. His soldiers looked down at the ground. Finally, one of his oldest companions stepped forward and said, "My king, we have followed you through every danger. We have fought beside you in every land. But now we are tired. We want to see our families again." Alexander stood there silent, staring at his men, the same men who had once charged fearlessly beside him. For the first time in his life, he realized something powerful. Even the greatest leader cannot rule the hearts of men forever. That night, he walked alone along the riverbank, listening to the sound of the water. He thought about his father, about Aristotle, about the fire that had driven him since childhood. And then he made his decision. The next morning, he called his generals and said, "We will go back." The soldiers cheered, crying tears of relief. Alexander smiled, but in his heart it felt like defeat. As they turned westward, heading home, he knew that he had reached the edge of the world, not the one on the map, but the edge of human endurance. He had conquered everything except one thing, the limits of life itself. The long road home was not easy. Alexander and his army crossed deserts so dry that men collapsed under the heat. Others died of thirst before reaching the next river. Still, the king marched at the front, sharing the same suffering as his men. When they finally reached Babylon, the city welcomed him like a god returned from the ends of the earth. He was only 32 years old, but he had done what no one before him ever had. He ruled from Greece to India, an empire of languages, cultures, and dreams. Yet inside, Alexander was restless. He spoke of new plans, of conquering Arabia, maybe even the distant lands beyond the sea. But the gods had written a different ending. One evening, during a feast, Alexander suddenly fell ill. At first, everyone thought it was nothing serious, but his fever grew worse each day. Soon, he could no longer stand or speak. His generals gathered around him, waiting for his final command. One of them asked, "To whom do you leave your empire, my king?" Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." And then he closed his eyes. The world fell silent. The man who had never been defeated in battle, the man who dreamed of uniting the world, was gone. His body was laid to rest in a golden coffin, but his soul became legend. Over the centuries, empires would rise and fall, kings would come and go, but the name Alexander the Great would be remembered. He had shown the world what one human being, guided by vision, courage, and an unbreakable will, could accomplish. And perhaps that is why his story still inspires us today. If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more through English, don't forget to subscribe to Talking English.